Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to the talk. Nice to see you. Doors have been closed, and did you lock them?
No.
It's important that you lock them. I'll introduce myself first, and we'll get into the talk. I'm a senior engineer at Cypress. We make a test runner that can test anything that runs in the browser. I work in the component testing part of Cypress. I'm a program developer at People Making Progress. I try to mention these organizations. People Making Progress is based in Tucker, Georgia, and it works with adults with developmental disabilities. I worked there full-time for about 7 years. It's where I got a lot of my kind of interest in accessibility and front-end and what you can do with front-end. I also volunteer at refcode.org, which I would recommend everybody check out. Refcode is an organization that teaches coding skills to refugees and immigrants. You can volunteer in person, that's in Clarkston, not too far from here, or you can volunteer online, and that's really helpful too. I have a lot of text in these slides because we're going to be talking about lists of things, and I also have a lot of links and resources at the end. So if you want to follow along or you want to get them later, this is where you can find the slideshow, and we'll show this again at the end as well. So here's how we're going to break down the talk. We'll do a little background about front-end development. I'm not trying to make too many assumptions about who's come to this talk, but I will explain who the talk is kind of directed at. And we'll talk about informal knowledge transfer, because that's how I learned a lot of the stuff that I'm going to try and teach today. Every time I'm at a job and I pick up something from a coworker, and I'm like, oh, that's not in the manual, that's not in a boot camp, that's not how you learn to program. Those are things I try to capture because you get lucky when you find those things out. We'll spend most of the talk talking about an example design of a website that my friend made and working through some of the considerations for that design. And then at the end, we'll try to wrap up kind of what we will gain by doing a process like I described to kind of break the design down in an orderly way. There's a bunch of stuff that we're not going to cover in this talk. We're not going to look at a lot of code, or we're not going to try to build the website we talk about. We'll try to talk about what you do before you write the website. And we're going to avoid specific frameworks and tools. All of them make HTML. Doesn't matter if you're in React or Vue or Angular. We're talking about ideas that go through that layer and talk to what the user actually touches, which is the HTML. And we're not going to talk about Cypress. I have a ton of things I'm really excited about, but this is not that talk. We might get to look at it if I'm fast enough. We'll get to look at it for a second, but we're not going to get in the weeds. The people I think would really benefit from this, if you're new to a front-end role or you're trying to get your front-end role or get more experience in front-end, this was the moment that I sort of was in when I picked up this technique, and that's why I think it would be useful if that's kind of where you are. But also, if you're able to get by in the front end, if you're a full stack engineer, and you sometimes work in the front end and you can sort of make things look like the design and you have the shapes and the fonts and stuff, this might be useful because there's often more to front end than it seems, and you can kind of get away with doing pretty weird front end work because browsers are really forgiving and they will make it work for you. And this also might be interesting if you interact with front end developers. If you're a designer or a product owner, to see the kinds of things that we need to pull out of the designs that you provide. So first, let's briefly go over the front-end development lifecycle. I know some of you know this. We all love it. Designers provide a beautiful website design. That's the first step. It's approved immediately by management, and it gets handed off to the engineers. No problems. Engineers rapidly make progress in an orderly fashion. The project is delivered on time and under budget. And that's it. We're all on vacation. We're done. Okay, obviously, that's not the world that we live in. If we lived in that world, there wouldn't really be any difficult parts of development. Usually it cycles between all of these various steps, and without a kind of common language, it cycles of information we've missed that we could have learned earlier. So briefly, informal knowledge transfer in the front-end roles. When I talk about that, I really want to narrow down what I mean. We sometimes call it on-the-job training, learning the ropes. You might learn some stuff if you get paired with a good senior in your first job. You might learn a bunch of things in your first 2 months that you didn't know before. It's not a core technology. It's not HTML or CSS. You don't pick it up in a tutorial. This is often because it's role specific. I needed this a lot when I worked at an agency. We got designs, we didn't always get to talk to the designers, we had to decide what to do and give estimates back based on the designs that we received. So it was a much different experience than a place where I worked, where I kind of did the prototyping. We didn't have a designer. It was a bad decision, but we didn't have a designer, so I was able to skip this step. This is the kind of stuff that can be a sign in interviews and things of maturity or experience in the industry when someone asks you a question and you're able to answer about you have a process. You understand an orderly way to break down something and figure out the work you need to do. So Nate was my coworker who helped me with this at my first job. Not everybody has a Nate, and so grateful to him and trying to pass it along. Okay, we'll get into the example. So let's just say we receive a design like this. We're going to focus on a landing page. This is for a clinical trial. You can imagine that you work at an agency and that you've been approached to build this and figure out what you need to do. This is flat, simple elements. This looks easy. This looks like it's not complicated. And people might not expect it to take a lot of time to put together something like this. And I think we get ourselves into trouble sometimes when we don't expect it to take a lot of time. Looks like web pages we're familiar with, looks like work we've done before. So this is the starting point for this talk. We have a goal in this scenario. So if we're gonna imagine we're talking to an engineer that's starting out a project like this, main goal is we wanna get the landing page about the medical trial. There's some extra stuff though. It's hooked up to a content management system. That totally changes what you have to do. You have to make components that can be authored and rearranged in the content management system. We expect that maybe they'll have more trials. They might want to A/B test different variants of the page. So these are interlocking, movable components that are not necessarily just static content you can put into a file. And the design is based on a desktop layout, but they expect it to work on mobile. It's normal. There's no direction in this file about what you're supposed to do for mobile. And yeah, I've worked many places where they just think you'll figure it out. You're the professional. Every screen size that's not this is going to be supposed to look nice. And so that's your job now to flag any complicated things. Once you've worked with people a lot, you often have just common techniques, and you say, oh, if I have columns, we stack them when they start to look weird. We have ways we can adjust the design. But it's often not provided up front, and nobody can provide every single screen size that you could possibly have. So what we've been asked to do, we want to give an estimate to the client. How long is it going to take to do? If it's just you, what can you do? How can we put this work into tickets to show what's complete and what's left to do? And then we're going to start building it out. The first time I was asked this question on the job that I got, I had done some work helping other things, and someone gave me a Photoshop file. We had a designer who worked in Photoshop. My boss was like, how long would it take to build this multi-step questionnaire? It wasn't very complicated, but it was a lot of style. Our designer was big on showing progress in multiple ways and stuff like that. And I turned to Nate and I was like, I don't know if this is days or weeks. I can't really tell how to answer this question. And he put it very simply. He's just like, well, think about all the things you have to do to make it and how long each of those things take. And then that's how long it takes. So that was pretty easy. And I think that watching Nate work, I was like, oh, think about all the things you have to do to make it is deceptive. That's not easy. If you could think of all those things in advance, sure, it would be easy. So here are the reasons that I think we sometimes underestimate front-end work, both in time and a little bit in value or effort or complexity. We often ballpark just what we can see. There's a really scary thing in here once you start to look at designs like this. There's this little chevron. There's a chevron of death over here where it says learn more. Anything can be under that. That could be a massive form. It often is something surprisingly complicated. In this case, I think we actually have the website. But yeah, that's the first thing. Like, watch out for those. This one, okay, it's got a list of things. It's not a drop-down. It's not a select menu. It's like a custom thing. And, they're probably going to want to author each icon independently and add and remove things in here. And what do? Okay, they do an auto scroll. I didn't know we had the auto scroll. So suddenly, this management of things that are not visible in design, if we skip that and we just go, okay, yeah, it's a static page, it's easy, that's one of the reasons we might underestimate things. Often we just try to give people what they want. Maybe I'm projecting here. I love to make stuff work. That's the reason a lot of us are developers, is we like putting pieces together. And it's really fun sometimes to take a big swing and be like, yeah, what do you mean you're asking me if I can do it in weeks? That's like a challenge. We're making a mistake if we see that as a challenge. Like, are you saying I can't do this website in a month? Watch me work myself into the ground. Others think that this is easy. People often just think front end is like, you don't have to solve problems because someone just showed you exactly what you're supposed to do. That file, just do that image, like that's what you have to build. And so even we can take that on ourselves and believe like it should be fast and we're failing if it's complicated, like we did it wrong. And then just in general, like there's all the unknowns and knowns and the risks of estimation. Sometimes it's easier to estimate the size, but people want dates, and like dates involve the rest of your life. You might get sick, you might have other work to do. So we're going to focus on recognizing the size by trying to take several passes through the design, which can have some benefits. Our main goal when we look at that page in any design is to look at the nature and structure of the content that's put in there and look for patterns and look for exceptions. We're going to start to think about what would our style needs be. Doesn't matter if it's coming in Tailwind or BAM or anything like that, but just what is our CSS supposed to do to the appearance of this page? And especially all of the work designers do. They've done something to present relationships between the content. So this big thing in here is probably like the H1 of the page. And these other headings and subheadings and paragraphs, all of this stuff is like related in some way, and the designer has done their work to present it in a hierarchy. And our job is to sort of figure out what that is, understand the content, and then understand what we need to build. And if we skip that, if we dive right in, we will just kind of put shapes places. We'll put divs and we'll put text and we'll make it visually match, but we'll lose all the information that the designer put in there. And often, sometimes it's not clear what something is, and you have a conversation with the designer about it, and you end up with like a better design and something that's easier to build. So the right code, that was my kind of deer in the headlights moment when I was asked to do this at first. It's like I suddenly, after years and years of coding as a hobby and making like utility things at jobs I had, I would just make up the HTML as I went. I was just kind of making things all together in one go. And now I have to decide like, what's the right code that a professional would write to do this thing? And nobody cared, right? It's often like a sighted mouse user telling you to do the work, and it's a sighted mouse user checking how well you did. They don't really care about the internal code, but there is still a right answer here, which is kind of centered on accessibility. And we'll take a little detour into accessibility, because when you start thinking about it, it's an amazing way to make all of your decisions in front end make sense. There's one sort of objective thing you can use. So roughly, how are we going to do it? Outside in, left to right, top to bottom, and we'll take multiple passes. I don't do this explicitly anymore, but in the beginning, to try to get good at this, I would do that. And start out, we'd look at layout level patterns. I'm going to go through the 5, and then we'll dive into each one. So first pass, layout level stuff. I say there's probably a grid, because I worked closely with the designer at that first job, and he would look at what I built, and all the pieces would look okay, but they didn't line up right. And he would just turn his head to the side. He'd be like, dude, what happened to the grid? And then he would show me the design file and where all the lines lined up with everything. And I was like, oh yeah, I built it one piece at a time. And so I didn't think about the overall grid, and I would have to go back and like make things nice. Next pass, I'm looking at element level patterns. I want to know about headings, fonts, spacing, like things that are relevant locally to a certain part of the page, not strictly HTML elements, but like design elements. What are we doing at the local level in our sections? Color is worth just doing all at once. Just take a pass through, understand all the colors, especially if they have names in the design software that you're using. That's fine. You can like look at the existing names designer gave colors. Structural ideas is talking about the logical organization of sections, independent from the layout. So like I said, those headings and those subheadings and lists and stuff like that, what's the underlying structure of the content? You could represent the same content with multiple layouts. And then everything else. There's going to be a whole bunch of things you see at the end where, okay, well, like weird things that are specific to this design, questions that occurred to you. It's really, really good to have these questions now, not at the time later when you're done 80% of the project and then you hit the part that has the question and it's like a fire drill to get answers and resolve problems before you deliver something. If you can start the conversations early, it helps a lot. At this point, we're going to speed run through this. There's a blog post I linked to as part of the links at the end that kind of gets into detail on this exact example. But there's a lot of things in here, and I think it's important to just touch on all of them. So we're going to kind of go through highlights. So on this design that we just looked at, these are the things that I took note of. There's sections with columns, there's a nav, there's a header, like basic stuff that makes this page look easy. But there's also that padding between each section, which tends to look really bad on mobile because when the page gets narrow, you have massive spaces, like a whole screen of space to drive between. So it's just little stuff in here. This seems fine. Other first impressions that I would take from this website is things like I like the design. I think it's cool that all the sections had questions. And I noticed, oh, one of the sections like is a question but doesn't have a question mark. I'm looking at good things and bad things because I want to be able to talk to the design team about what's in this. And it's really nice if you don't just go to them with problems and complaints, but try to recognize the hard work they've already done. One thing I thought was weird was some font sizes were different. I've actually found designers kind of like it if you say, this thing is 11 pixels, should it be 12? Like it communicates that you care about executing what they did, even if they made a mistake. But you're paying attention to it. And I mentioned that I like the logo, this thing with the gradient. I just think that's nice. You can never capture this again in the same way after you've looked at it forever. You just see it as the work you have to do. So having questions early is important. So getting into element level ideas, lots of things happen here. This is the broadest part of going through it, is trying to find patterns in here and understand what the components are. Oftentimes, if it's a totally greenfield project and depending on the designer, there might not be named components in the design that we're talking about. It's just stuff. So having a way to give your own language to the things that you're seeing in here and start to group them yourself will make a big difference in just what you're able to start figuring out for your components and your styles. One thing I noticed here is like there's bullet points in a lot of these lists. There's like little bullets here. There's that kind of ones here that are not really bullets. They're just like little icons that have different colors and stuff. So things that you just would glance over, and then when you build it, you're like, oh, this is not 10 seconds of work. This is like, you know, I have to go get the icon. I have to do a couple of hours, which doesn't sound much, but you add it up over an entire project, and it's a lot different than you expected. There's some inconsistent stuff in here. Inline links in the text are underlined. So I've got like a link over here somewhere. This is underlined, but these are also links. This is not underlined. So we don't just have one kind of link. Different variations of the logo a few places. There's this thing here, this card, it seems to repeat. You can imagine if you have a content management system, someone's going to say, okay, I'll just drag a card. Like that's a whole obvious unit. A lot of the things that are here are less obviously exactly the same units. These might be like really customized, just like rich text where people can put whatever. But you also have to have that conversation now. because maybe the branding doesn't allow you to just put a rich text field. Maybe you have to go here and make a bold section and a plain text section so that like content authors can't put links and other things in the header if they want to really control it. So it's a good time to validate those assumptions. Color palette in this page is pretty straightforward. You just probably some CSS variables. If there's not like a design system you have to adhere to, this can be a surprisingly simple part of this one. Then there's structural ideas. And a minor detour kind of into accessibility, which I know this is not the accessibility room, but I timed that so wrong. There we go. I was like, yeah, this is the point. Everywhere we're talking about front-end development is the accessibility room. Everywhere we're talking about our products and designs is the accessibility room, because disabled people are everywhere, and it's not just something you can tack on at the end. So as we look at the structural ideas, an example here is work that we're going to do to understand what's in the page so that we as developers can communicate that properly. And while accessibility is important, there's other benefits that we'll talk about. So here, just in that hero section, this looks so simple. There's like 4 different text styles in here that we would do. We have to be able to author an image. We probably have alt text for the image. Haven't really talked about the header or the navigation yet, but just like little stuff here. And if you repeat that throughout the page, you've got like pages and pages of your own notes about the tree of content that's in here. So there was a great talk yesterday about accessibility. I'm not going to go into that level of detail. And my background working with disabled adults, I also don't think about compliance as much as I think about practical usability. I really hate it when someone has to ask for help to use something that they could otherwise use independently if it was coded correctly. I worked for about a year with a person who has like limited use of his arms, and so he has a wheelchair, and I was his assistant. And he could have me type for him and have me do some things for him. But he could also access some things by himself, depending on what supported the technology that he had. And so if you want privacy to do your banking and you don't want to have an assistant to help you with that, that's completely legitimate. And the decisions we make when we're building something in the front end are really affecting the ability of someone to be independent. So this code that we write that represents the nature and structure of the content will let somebody using a screen reader or other assistive technology think about hitting a list, and they'll be able to figure out how long is it and skim it, or listen to all of the headings on the page to understand at once what's contained in there. Likewise, find all the links, jump straight to the navigation. All this stuff is kind of done through HTML. And it's managed in the accessibility tree. So your browser makes this from your HTML. If you are new to the accessibility tree, it is available in Chrome DevTools. You can see it for any website that you're on. And this is the API that a screen reader would use to determine what are the sections and lists and articles and things that are in the page. So it's not doing that from the HTML itself. The browser's converting that into this, and if we don't put anything in there, if we make our website with just divs and spans, there's nothing from Chrome to provide to a screen reader that would help understand and navigate the content, so a person has to just listen to it all to understand what's in the page. To zoom in on this a little bit, the accessibility treats divs and spans and a few other things as generic containers. You can see one of them here is different, and when we open it up, it's way more expressive. And this is just in your DevTools, you can open it kind of instantly if you want to. And so now we can see the nature and structure of the content much more clearly. And even if we don't do any user testing with accessibility specifically in mind, if we're able to open the DevTools and see if this makes sense, we have a head start on becoming accessible. We have a lot of the basics done. The other part of this is that we write code that's easier to understand. Because if this makes sense, if this can be broken down programmatically by a computer and announced in a way that makes sense, then our code itself is easier to understand. So we're going to go into a file like this, or a file like this. And there's a little bit of nesting here, but often there's a lot more nesting. And we can see here, using VS Code's like built-in tools, we can understand that there is a sequence. We can see where we are. If we have to come back in 6 months and maintain this navigation, add an item or something like that, it's really quick to come in and go, oh, here's where the last list item ends. I'm going to add a new one that looks like the others. And I don't know if people spend as much time as me like at the bottom of a really deep DOM tree, kind of counting in a little bit, figuring out which div is the end of the div that had the class that said navigation, and doing it wrong and breaking the file and having to back up after you save. This is, I think it's much easier to work with code that is reflective of the intention of the content. This is very similar to naming variables and stuff like that when we talk about code quality. It's much, much easier to read something that's expressive. So even though I think we should do it anyway, it aligns with something else that we benefit from ourselves. A lot of times I think people think accessibility makes things harder. It's an extra burden, and that it contradicts moving fast and working in a like otherwise fast, correct way. But I think it's really closely aligned with that. It's also easier to test. I see a lot of tests that use element locators to pick something that we're going to click on or something that we're going to check. And the thing that we use to locate the element is just like an irrelevant class name or a sequence of elements that we're going to drill down to. But the stuff that we just showed with the semantic HTML is things users would actually care about. So this is a one line of a test that we might write. And in the top, we can see a typical thing that we might do to make sure we target the right link. But nobody cares about this div a pattern. It doesn't mean anything. When our test fails because we changed the DOM, we're really annoyed. We're annoyed about testing. We're annoyed about like having to rewrite things that are unrelated. Like we have to change the test for a feature that still works because we didn't break it. The test is just wrong. And the more I think about this, a selector like this is not just like finding the element to click. It is specifying the DOM. The test is specifying, hey, it's correct for this A to be inside a div that's a direct child of another div, and that means something, and we want to fail when that's not true anymore. As opposed to the bottom example, there should be a main navigation landmark in your page. It should have a link to home. That's true always. When this test fails because we changed the DOM, it means we moved that link out of where it's supposed to be, or we stopped having a nav element. These are both things that we want to fail a test for. I think I can get in and show the example of this because I really want to show it practically. There's an extra disadvantage to this top one. Not only is it specifying the wrong thing, it will fail the test when you do the right thing. So if we try to improve this code, if we look at this bottom one here, and we go, okay, I'm just going to work on this. Let me fix the div to be a nav. That's the first step. Let's forget about even listing the items. Now I come back. Did I edit the right one? Cypress freeze. Div A. Yeah, this is the one that says boo. This imports from here. I'm not sure what's gone wrong there. I don't think we should spend too much time debugging it. But generally, what happens here is this fails. And when this fails, not only have we not been able to write the code that is correct here, but we've gone back and said, oh, we specified this. It actually makes it harder to make the code correct. Okay. And then there's everything else. There's quite a bit of everything else. At this point in the process, you're probably really excited to get started with your coding. You have all the ideas. Everything's been flowing. You've talked to the people that you need to talk to. You have answers. You're ready to go. There's still all this stuff, though. This stuff that's like accumulated as you were starting. So now is the time to capture all of the questions that would lead to conversations that would be inconvenient to have right before release. So as we're getting started, asking these questions, even if they turn out most of them have obvious answers, the one or two questions that lead to other questions can be worked out in parallel while you're fixing up your initial components and getting your CSS in place and all that stuff. What we can do is have conversations that pay off later and that don't slow you down. So things that would be blockers can kind of go away if you see them coming early enough. And this is why a process like this can signal more maturity, more experience, and can help you have a smoother life as a developer, because you're starting to see into the future a little bit by digging into the design. So let's just wrap up a little bit. We'll look at some resources. Why do we follow a process like this? Finding missing pieces earlier is great. I have several times had to ask people, what is under that chevron? And sometimes they don't know. It's like, it's going to be a menu. It'll do something. Well, okay, but we have to build it now. Like, we're estimating how long it will take to build. And sometimes it's content, sometimes it's not. But just surfacing those missing pieces can make a really big difference. You can be helped more easily. We didn't really touch on this, but I've definitely had experiences where I'm building something and someone offers to help because we're getting close to the deadline. And what I have is 50 things that are half done. There's not a whole piece that you can hand over to someone and say, oh, please, here's what's not done yet. Go do it. It's self-contained. Thank you. It's often I don't even know if I can take the time to catch this person up on where all the 50 things are to find out what they can help with. If we're organized a little bit in advance and we need to go faster, we can split up the things that can be split up because we understand what's involved in the work. This really helps with the component architecture that you're trying to build as well. Seeing what's reused, what you should commit to, what should be shared. This is a lot easier if you've assessed not just one page, but an overall design like this. It's really more clear what problems your CSS needs to solve. I've often seen oh, there's a 2-column layout, and then actually what you do is you have an image and a text, and then if there's more than one, it's the other way around. So it's like a checkerboard pattern, and then when you get to mobile, all your images stack together, and your text stacks together, and they don't seem like they make sense anymore because we've just not considered checkerboarding it on mobile, which it takes a little bit of forethought, but you don't, unless you totally assess the design at the start, you don't always see that. It's really good when accessibility starts early in the process. It is part of the reputation of accessibility is that it's difficult, and part of that is because it is difficult. If you've committed to something, and you've made your own carousel, something like that, that's hard to make accessible because you did things that were unusual to make a carousel work that matched a design that you saw. If you start understanding, oh, this is a carousel pattern, you're probably going to pick one of the 4 libraries that has an accessible carousel in it, and you're not going to have to spend time rescuing the work you already did. You just use something that's tested and that we know works. And even if it's not perfect, it's a much better head start. And finally, just sizing the project. Often when you come away with all these details, it's like an intimidating pile of stuff that you're going to have to chew through. And that's actually okay. It's better for the project to seem slightly bigger because we know that something will take that extra space anyway, than to be yeah, I can get this done in a weekend. And sure, you can make it look like that design at that one screen size, at that one zoom level. You can solve all those surface problems that you can see maybe in a weekend, but you haven't really found the true size of the work. So here's a bunch of resources. I have 2 blog posts that are kind of related to what we've talked about. One is about turning designs into code. It looks at this exact example. The other one is writing strong test locators. So this is trying to make a case for like what we just did, using accessibility, text content, labels as the foundation of front-end testing so that you have a way to depend on stuff that matters and not depend on stuff that's irrelevant that we don't want to fail tests for. Everything else in here, Homer Gaines did a talk yesterday. He's got a really great article like Foundational. These are all friendly accessibility resources. If you're new, if you intentionally didn't go in the accessibility room, this is stuff that you can, I think is pretty approachable. And this is kind of the summary of what, like, I sometimes feel like it's controversial to ask for accessibility, but what is a website? What are we building? Big, expensive, complicated machine that loads HTML into browsers. And most of what I've been asking for and talking about today is just that it might as well be the right HTML. There's a reason we don't have just one element. We have a bunch of them, a couple of hundred-ish, and it should reflect what's in the page. All right, that gets me to the end. So any questions, anything anyone would like to talk about?
One question and then follow-up.
Yeah.
First would be it be okay to save a copy of your presentation?
Yeah, that's why it's there. Yeah, go for it.
Second one is, do you usually visually outline these processes, like pseudocoded or anything, or is this something that is like hardwired into your process at this point?
When you do it over and over, it becomes that way. But initially, I would use paper a lot. I found that really made it concrete for me. And the great thing about paper is when you have assumptions that are wrong, you have to like scratch it out. You've got friction. Every time you made the diagram wrong, you're like, oh, I thought this would be easier. Oh, I thought this was nested under this. Like that is, so paper was my favorite way, and I still like it for like new complicated ideas. And yeah, drawing the tree, sketching out. I think we used to have a lot of like, hey, here's printer paper that never got used in the printer, but we would just draw pictures of the websites we were trying to make on it and understand and label things and figure out how they fit together. Yes? I think like we didn't touch on forms at all because forms are so complicated. But there are a lot of patterns that show up in designs that need your attention as a front-end developer, that like form fields without labels, for example, or a form field that has a label in the text, and then you type in the form and the label goes away. And I wish really what we should do is push back on that pattern would be great, because having a label go away means you can't review the form. Like, did I put the right thing in the right place? I have no idea, because nothing has a label. But also, the way we often execute those things is using placeholder text or using something visual. And if we use the HTML to associate the label with the text content, it can be announced correctly to screen readers. Somebody using voice control can say, click on first name field or something like that if it's correctly associated. You get all that for free. So aside from like the landmark stuff and the document structure stuff, forms I think are like even more important for just critical usability. Oh, yes.
More of an accessibility question again. Do you consider it okay to use divs to kind of do some like high level, like maybe put 4 articles next to each other in like a clickable thing? Like will a screen reader still like look through it and see those articles?
Yes, it will.
You can use it for loose structure, but don't
Yeah.
around content.
I use them a lot. They're not inherently bad. Like when you said that if something's intentionally got no meaning, like we just need to group something and the grouping doesn't matter except for visually, it's almost like a progressive enhancement over the actual structure. The main thing to watch out for there is if you're using flex containers and you reorder content, that can be disorienting because there are users who will see a visual order but then use their tab key and it won't match because there are things like that. And we also picture users as doing one of the modalities of like using assistive technology, but really there are people who use screen readers, who use Zoom, who use the keyboard in many combinations. So it should all align. If we reorder the content visually, we should restructure the DOM if we have to, if that order matters. And if it matters, it matters. So that's the main risk of like a generic div, yeah. Yes? That's you, yeah.
I may have missed this, but to go back to the time factor, like, for instance, I know like everybody's different, but how would you figure out, all right, now I've done all these things, I think it'll take me 6 weeks?
Yeah, I think like Nia did a talk earlier where she talked about technical debt, and it's much easier to be like, well, there's 50 things to do. And if you leave me alone for 6 weeks, you will have a website at the end of it. If I am in 10 hours of meetings a week, over 6 weeks, we've actually lost a week and a half of that. So, okay, it's going to take 2 months now because of my regular meeting cadence. And even then, it's a guess because of the unknown unknowns. So often the way to frame it to me that's most useful is like, I know the minimum size. I know if everything went perfectly, it would be 2 weeks. Not everything's going to go perfectly, but I know I can't do it in a day. And I know I have to have all these conversations. And they won't all get back and resolved on time. So I try to pick a generous estimate that allows for the other things that are in my job that I have to do. And because you have like, listen, nobody wants to read the big thing that you made. If you're like, there's 50 things and it's going to take 2 weeks, let me tell you about all 50 of them, they'll just say, okay. You can back it up because you've like counted the things, which no one has done. Yeah.
So with that, like let's say you estimated that it'll take you, for instance, 6 weeks, and maybe if you're working with a customer, client, or even like your boss, they're like, no, we need it in 4. Do you then kind of like start negotiating like, all right, I can do these things by 4 weeks, or have you ever had to do that?
That's a really good point, actually, because now you've identified what all the pieces are, and you can say, okay, it's going to be 4 weeks. Which 30 of these 50 pieces are we going to do in 4 weeks? And it's like on the product owner or the client to say what they choose. So you've got language to talk about all those pieces versus sketching it out first. Like you make really rapid visual progress when you do front end. So you can have something that has all the pieces and none of the wiring and none of the form submissions. It looks great and it looks the same way for a month because you're doing all the work underneath. Those are really frustrating situations to be in because you feel like every demo you show the same thing and you're like, I wrote code that relates to this in the last sprint, but it doesn't visually change anything. So if you have like the ability to make progress in a more structured way and even to hold back on some of the visual pieces so that the pieces that you show in demos are like done, it becomes much more obvious what we might cut. Like what's not 50 things halfway done, but 25 things are done. And if you're able to work that way, I think that helps a lot. Yes? Yeah, it's great.
So I worked for 2 months with a company as like an internship doing layouts for a designer. And they had several rules like we're going to support down to 250 pixel wide viewport widths. We're going to always break our mobile here. We're always going to have a design that's done in mobile and in desktop. Any tablet stuff, you kind of got to work back and forth with the designer. Is there a great way to sort of fastline that when you are being onboarded or when you like hire a freelance designer, or are there any tips or tricks for kind of like, I know what kind of questions I like asking when I'm approaching these problems?
Yeah, I think I don't really like a design that specifies every breakpoint too much. Sometimes it inspires some creativity. So when you get down to the mobile size, not only are things nicely designed, but they're in totally different places. And it's a totally different like DOM structure. So what I really like is a standard size that we design for and to know the designer's preferred strategy to resolve these things. Show me some examples of mobile websites that you like. And then front-end developers can put you in that ballpark and you can dial it in from there. But then you're talking about something that flows naturally from the primary design, whether that's mobile or desktop. We work on an application that's a desktop app, so we don't have users on mobile, but we have people who split their screen in half for development, and we have all sorts of responsive concerns that we don't explicitly design for. And at our company, the design engineers are like the people who will review a pull request when we say, I did some strange stuff to make this work. Is that cool? And then they can guide it in right before it merges. I feel like that gives you a much more pragmatic solution because it works with the code you already wrote instead of coming back with a design that's like super different.
Can I have the first slide?
Yeah, you can. Which slide should we go to?
The first one, you had those sites that you had for disability.
Oh, yeah. I'll go back a little more. So many slides. There we go.
Not that one, the first one.
The very first.
We were talking about like something that you help in
Oh, yeah, that's up here on this one, too. I should have made that more clear. That's the presentation link. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's why, this is not full of, like, you can't write these links down and go to them. Like, I find that really hard. Cool. I have a book to give away. Josh Justice, if anybody lives in Atlanta, you might know Josh. He's a developer. He does a lot of testing stuff. He has a book he just released called Outside In TDD, based on React development. So I'm looking for the first person to put their hand up who wants to learn more about React. I think I saw yours. There you go. Enjoy. You got to sit in the front row. Also, what a survey. Everybody seems to want to learn more about React. You didn't see it because you're in the front row, but like 20 hands went up behind you. That's good to know. Yes? It's called Outside In TDD. Is that right?
Outside in React development, TDD.
Yeah. So if you're new to test-driven development, that's the TDD Josh is talking about. And he also has like a statement at the start that's like a philosophy of software development. Why is it hard? Why do we have to talk about it? What are the skills we need? It's really amazing. So I'm like very happy with the book that he wrote, and hopefully I will have more to give away soon. Yes?
Just kind of occurred to me, kind of a small point, but in that design, they had an area that was black with white text, most was white with black text. A lot of sites now will respect like the dark mode. So do you often go back to your designers and see that technology that you're maybe not aware of, where your design doesn't work with technology that you could be taking better use of? Do you guys have that kind of back and forth?
Yeah, we do. And I think that that's sort of our role on the front end side as well, of like, we need to be able to tell you, as a designer, you're not always that informed of like accessible needs, but somebody who prefers dark mode because of like light sensitivity or something like that, it's probably frustrating if you invert a design and there's still bright pieces standing out at you. So we've had that conversation a little bit internally actually about our tooling, because we want really good visual separation between some areas, and often the good way to do that is like, okay, one part's dark and one part's light, but then we have a friend who gets migraines with the bright lights, and he has to turn the light up to see the dark parts. So he like is turning the bright part up as well. Yeah. You have a question?
How do you, so one of the things I find frustrating with trying to do this is scaling. So I may be, as a front-end engineer, aware I'm working with a whole bunch of full-stack engineers, and then it's that negotiation of you're being the in-between between the design and the rest of the engineering team. How do you navigate that and try to scale the same accessibility?
I think I'm still learning that. We're quite a small team, and a lot of people that work with me came from like the medical industry, where they were required because of government contracts and stuff. Compliance was required. So there's a broad support for doing it. But even for us, we're in the middle of a project of like getting everyone in the organization familiar with it, so that it becomes like the acceptance criteria for a ticket will include it should be accessible, which encourages us to think about things that are easy to build in an accessible way. And I suspect, and I really hope, is going to help us deliver faster, because we're going to use recognizable components that we could maybe get from somewhere else. All right, well, thank you, everybody. That's it. Thanks a lot.